up, everybody? This is Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations, number 30. And in the building, we got an dear old friend of mine from the IU Bloomington days, Dr. Rashawn Ray, Assistant Professor of Sociology at University of Maryland, College Park. What's going on, Dr. Ray? How are you?
Things are going good. Dr. Bradley, I really appreciate you involving me in this conversation. I'm really excited about all the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation because you're bringing something slightly different to the table with the sociology and things. So you know what you got to do to get into the club. How did you become Outkasted?
Well, so I actually grew up in Atlanta, and I spent my elementary school years there. So I actually moved back to Tennessee in 1992, and obviously that was the year in which Outkast was formed, and then 2 years later we have their first signature album coming out. And so for me, it was very much a part of my childhood, but also a formidable part of me growing up in Atlanta, as I had several family members, my uncles in particular, who was still living in Atlanta. So I would go down there multiple times a year from Murfreesboro, which is 3 hours away from Atlanta. And so Outkast, as they were coming up, was very much a part of me coming up as well, as being just slightly younger than they were, and really seeing them take on hip-hop, rap music, broader mainstream media in very different ways by doing things on their terms as teenagers growing up in the South.
I think that's so. Okay. So do you have any favorites, or is that not fair?
Oh gosh, it's so many. So it's funny. Recently, I was just bumping AT-Aliens in the car. I went through some old CDs, which obviously people don't do quite a bit, and pulled that out. Bombs Over Baghdad is also all of their music, depending on what's going on, really touches me in different ways. One of their, obviously first hits when Andre 3000 was more or less talking about how they had gained all this popularity, but the money didn't come along with that. And so that really becomes something that really sticks with me. Oftentimes we look at celebrities as being rich, and although they may be famous, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're rich. And that's essentially what he was talking about. And I think that has also continued to manifest over time as we think about whether that be entertainers or even athletes, primarily these occupations where we see high-profile African Americans. It doesn't always mean that the wealth comes along with that. And so I think that they continue to highlight that in the work that they do.
Great. So you do research on black masculinity, class, all that awesome stuff. You have such a long, CV of research that I will probably take 30 minutes just looking at that. But it's well deserved. It's really fascinating stuff. So as somebody from the South, from Atlanta and also in Tennessee, what are some of the ways that we can think about Outkast as a kind of like an entry point, if you will, in understanding Southern black masculinity and class?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first way is as it relates to masculinity, what we see is that they presented a very different presentation of self for how we traditionally think about masculinity. How we traditionally, particularly at that time, were thinking about masculinity in hip-hop. Obviously now it's kind of, I think they're going into a new period, but for a while there in the late 90s and 2000s, it was kind of all about bling bling, and before that it was kind of the gang banging era. And here comes Outkast coming up in kind of the middle of these two eras. And what we see is that their presentation of self, meaning their clothing, their swagger, the way that they present themselves to others, the way that they spoke, was very different from what we had traditionally seen. And part of that has to do with southern cities and the ways in which they're configured. Unlike being in more northern urban areas, what we see is more of a suburban sprawl type of city, even in Atlanta. So you don't have a traditional inner city or inner city neighborhoods. Instead, things tend to be flat, right? And so even if you have housing projects, oftentimes it's just 1 or 2 levels. It's not necessarily 10 or 20 stories high like you find in New York or Chicago or Philly or what have you. So in that regard, their presentation of self and the ways in which they presented themselves as it relates to masculinity is very different from what we had traditionally seen. And again, part of that has to do with the clothing. So this was even before what people would say Andre 3000 really took off and became more eccentric. I would argue that he was always that way, but we saw a very different style. In many ways, I align Outkast to one of my other favorite hip hop groups, Camp Lo, in terms of the ways in which they presented themselves as being very different. So they were bringing back some of kind of the P-Funk presentations that we saw in the 1970s to hip hop music, and obviously that corresponded with kind of the southern urban sprawl of cities that, in many ways, spanned it across the socioeconomic gradient. I mean, growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, I mean, even still today, obviously, we have a hyper level of segregation, and Atlanta is still set up in that particular way. So it makes sense why we might see these alternative forms of masculinity develop in the midst of still being and living in urban poverty. I mean, obviously, Big Boy has several siblings, and at the time in which they were forming, he had to move to another place. This was further outside of the city. And so we see this dynamic, which is very different from what was going on in more urban areas where we saw a higher density of poverty. In southern cities like Atlanta, we see a sprawling level of poverty. And I think that it really resulted in them presenting themselves and talking about things in very, very different ways from what other artists were actually doing.
I think that too, just thinking about just the southern region of the United States in general, one of the challenges that we often have to think through is that there seems to be like a monolithic understanding of what southern poverty and class looks like. It's kind of like, but then the additional layer to that would be, let's say, if you're in rural areas, you know what I mean? Like if you're in Georgia, Atlanta might have the sprawling poverty that you're mentioning, but if you go to Albany, for example, where I'm from, the poverty's a little bit different. You know what I'm saying? I just think that that's a really important aspect of the conversation, is that there are multiple entry points to conversations about poverty in the South. But why do you think that there's still that lingering urbanity that's associated with how poverty is understood and accepted?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean, you make several great points. Part of it is that the literature, particularly the sociology literature, hasn't done a really good job of looking at rural poor people, right? They also haven't done a really good job of, at least over the past 20 or 30 years, at looking at working class white people or poor white people. They exist all over the country. As you know from being in graduate school in Indiana when we were there together, that exists. I mean, you leave these little academic bubbles and you see that. Throughout the South, we act as if either poor white people don't exist on one hand, or poor black people only exist in urban areas. And so that also is also linked with the fact that the South is ubiquitously framed as being the same, right? And that's what you're getting at. That there's no variation, that there are these homogeneous pockets, and you've moved around quite a bit. You've lived in several southern cities, several southern states, as have I. And one of the things you notice is that they're all different, as you're talking about. They all have their different style, their own different flavor. Now, Atlanta does take on its uniqueness because of the fact that it is one of the few cities, probably outside of Charlotte and maybe a couple of others, that have been able to sustain a black middle class area, right? That sets up a different level of heterogeneity among black people that we traditionally see in larger cities. And so Atlanta, you have that. I mean, you have Atlanta. I mean, you have basically one of the busiest airports in the world. I mean, you have CNN, you have Turner. I mean, you have these large companies that are situated in Atlanta that really set up different types of interactions among black people that doesn't always exist in other places. The other thing that bothers me, I mean, living outside of the South now for I don't know, I think it's been well over 10 years, and being in the Midwest, living in California, now living in Maryland. I guess people consider it the Mid-Atlantic, the East Coast. Is still very southern to me, but at the end of the day, one of the things that's interesting is the ways in which people frame the South as really being the same, in the sense that everyone is country, everyone lives in the backwoods, everyone possibly has a plot of land that they're out in the back doing something with. And of course, none of this could be further from the truth. Now, obviously, a lot of this has to do with the fact that people just simply haven't traveled to see it for themselves, but it also speaks to the ways in which the media frames what the South looks like. And I think Outkast challenges this while also reaffirming what the South should be. One statement I always make, and several of my friends, one of my fraternity brothers in particular from Memphis would always say, well, I'm Southern, but I'm not country. And I think those are two very different terms. Oftentimes, being Southern simply means you're from the South. You have a certain set of ideals and cultural characteristics that make you and your family and your friends up. But country becomes something very different in terms of living in rural areas. I think oftentimes we forget that black people were excluded from having access to land, from access to certain avenues to build wealth, which is one of the main ways in which whites were able to build wealth is through land accumulation. So in that regard, even though blacks are in the South, it doesn't mean that they are part of the key dimensions that makes the South what it actually is or how it's perceived.
Yeah, and then you were talking about the construction of like family units, and that's one of the running jokes in Southern folks is that we always have the play cousins and the play uncles, and I'm guilty, you know what I'm saying? Like as my friends are starting to start their families and stuff, I'm the auntie, and those are like my nieces and nephews. But you do a lot of really fascinating work on fraternal bonds and fraternities and race and identity. And as I was kind of getting ready for this conversation, I started thinking about, can we think of Organized Noise and the Dungeon family as a fraternal bond? You know what I'm saying? Like that type of brotherhood that's there that still kind of resonates in really interesting ways that hasn't been replicated. What are some of your thoughts on the ways that we can think about Outkast, and Organized Noise and the Dungeon family as this sort of fraternity organization?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. I think it's a great question. I mean, these individuals um, came together from a very formidable age, being teenagers, some of them having been friends long before that, to come together with Organized Noise, Outkast, Goody Mob, and form this group of individuals who, from the base, when they really had nothing in terms of monetary resources, if you will, came together to put out a unique sound of music. And I think over the past 20 years or so, we've seen that progression in terms of whether that be what Outkast did together and separately. So with their last album, which is very unique. So you have a group of individuals who decide they're going to put out separate albums and, of course, collaborate on the album, being in studio, working on different songs, but more or less putting out different albums on the same album. I mean, that's so unique. And it speaks to their brotherhood and the bond that they have. Now, obviously, they're going back out on tour. I can't wait to see what they're going to be able to come up with. Obviously, as I guess Andre 3000 kind of works out his the deals that he has with the company that they're with. And so with Dungeon Family, what's interesting is, I'm actually conflicted because I was fortunate to meet several of those guys in the late 90s. And I say this because one of the people who I met, who I found to be very intriguing and continue to follow his career, is CeeLo. Now, CeeLo, he blows up. He's on The Voice. I mean, it's great seeing him in this avenue. And then, obviously, recently he has this very unfortunate incident where essentially he by all accounts, he raped a woman or put a roofie in her drink, these sort of things, and then came out with a statement basically saying that, she's unconscious and she is not able to consent. This gets back to kind of southern states in many ways and some of the archaic laws that are on the books. Now, I say that to say, even when family members or fraternal or sorority members do certain things that we don't agree with or we vilify, it doesn't mean that we push them to the side. And I go back to when one of the Goody Mob members was severely injured in a vehicle accident, and I remember that vividly. And what happened at that point was that the Dungeon family really rallied around him and his family, and from what I understand, really took care of them in more ways than just going to be a social resource, but in many ways became a financial resource and also a cultural resource in terms of being someone there for this person's entire family. And I think that's the bond that you see. So even though we see what's happening with CeeLo in the public, it's very interesting to think about what may be happening behind the scenes in terms of individuals who are part of the Dungeon family coming together to support that. And the other thing about the Dungeon family that I'll add, they are one of the few groups, I would say, where they still periodically come back together. And I think that's what you were getting at about them being different, right? I mean, we've heard of all these different groups, primarily related to labels, whether that be Cash Money or No Limit or Rockefeller. What's different in this regard is that, yeah, these individuals, I guess, originally were kind of on the same label, but they really came together to put out a certain sound of music, to be collaboratory, to do something different for what was going on in Atlanta, Georgia, and throughout the South, to really be something that people identified with. And through that, then they catapulted themselves to national and international status. So although you may see one or two individuals from the groups who are most popular, whether that be Andre 3000 or CeeLo, what you see is that the other members of the group are still very much involved in different aspects of what's going on. And I would bet not just in the studio or through entertainment or through their businesses, but also in their personal lives. And these are the types of things that we don't always see in terms of how people come back together when they came together for something that was very different than just trying to be rich. But they came together because they wanted to do something different, do something unique. I mean, that's the whole point of the reason why Outkast is called Outkast, because they really viewed themselves as being different and on the outskirts, and they were rewarded for that.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about too is that, you know, what the influence of actually being from the South is in terms of thinking about them as a group than, say, Wu-Tang Clan, for example, who still has those fraternal bonds also. I mean, you know, the idea of fraternity in hip-hop isn't anything necessarily new, but I think it is kind of interesting to think about how that actual acute southernness that you were mentioning in Dungeon Family separates them from what was going on, especially given the fact that when they were first being introduced to hip-hop, they weren't part of that fraternal bond because of their southernness. You know what I'm saying? So, like, how does that idea of region really implicate what those fraternal bonds look like or how they translate to a larger audience?
Great question. I mean, I think Wu-Tang Clan is probably the epitome of looking at this, where they came together as a group, but they were still very much in tune with putting out their own work or collaborating with different members in various ways, and more or less supporting the popularity of certain members, whether that be, you know, ODB or Method Man or RZA, and the other individuals kind of filling in, or even Ghostface Killer. I mean, I think all of them, similar with the Dungeon Family, really speaks to that. Obviously, what you're speaking to is something in the South becomes very unique, where in the 90s, the South was still viewed as the little brother as it relates to hip-hop. I mean, as New York and LA in particular, and then the Bay Area started coming along with E40 and others, was really dominating what was going on. I think then we started to see the South, through the Dungeon Family, be able to create a niche. And I think the reason they created that niche is because listeners in the South, and not just individuals in the South, but throughout the country, needed something different. They needed an alternative to the similarities in what was going on. And I don't think we can separate that from the fact that at that time, kind of the East and West Coast were really beefing and feuding and fighting and shooting and killing in many ways individuals who affiliated themselves with both groups. And so in the South, it was something very different, where people got back to the music, where the music was feel-good music, where the music was something that people could listen to in various settings. So for example, the thing I loved about Outkast is that I could listen to it with my mother and grandmother around, where some of the other music that was being put out at the time, I couldn't listen to it around them. It was in many ways disrespectful. And Outkast, and in many ways Dungeon Family, whether it be Sleepy Brown or members of Goody Mob, have really stayed true to that as being different. And that gets back to an alternative frame of masculinity. The South really allowed it, and I think part of that has been the sprawlness of the South, allowed for a plethora of different images and presentations as it relates to masculinity in ways that potentially in more urban and denser spaces did not allow for that plurality as it relates to masculinity. And I think that's why we saw and still do see the different types of clothing, the different types of presentations, very different types of swagger as it relates to what it means to be a man and what it means to be a human or a person from the South or an entertainer or a rapper. So they really complicated the simplistic ways in which mass media, record labels in particular, were trying to put out a monolithic image of black men. And you had Outkast and the Dungeon Family Goody Mob, coming together to create a different form of aesthetic for what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be masculine.
Dope. Dr. Ray, how can the people get in touch with you? What you got going on? All that good stuff.
Oh, well, so obviously, I mean, they can go to the University of Maryland website and find me there. One of the best ways to get in touch with me is on Twitter. Past 2 years, I recently got on Twitter the past couple of years and really enjoy it. And my handle is Sociologist Ray. So it's just SOCIOLOGISTRAY. Very active on there in terms of posting different types of issues related to the topics that we've been discussing today: masculinity, social class, race, gender, sexuality, these particular outcomes. Really trying to stay up on what's going on, and then obviously accessing the work that I've already published, which can be found on my university website.
Awesome. Dr. Rashawn Ray in the building. Thank you so much for sharing the knowledge with us and everything. We appreciate you, sir.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Exciting.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all next week. Y'all be easy.